Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to University of Education Lahore, Department of English. I am Fakir Hussain and I'm teaching course on 19th century English novel. Welcome to my presentation on Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. And in this presentation, I would try to cover a few aspects of Thomas Hardy's career as a novelist, some details about his life and major works. We'll discuss the historical background and philosophical aspect of his novel writing. Then we'll discuss his art of characterization, uh, plot construction, and definitely an introduction to the novel of Thomas Hardy, The Mayor of Casterbridge. So let's start with Hardy's biographical details. He was born on June 2nd, 1840, Higher Bockhampton, Dorset, England. Hardy was the eldest son of the four children of Thomas Sir and Jemima. His father was a stonemason, builder, and his wife Jemima was a domestic servant. Hardy's mother especially wanted a better life for her son, so she sent him to the best school available in the nearby town, Dorchester. But earlier he spent a year at the village school as well. Then he moved to the Dorchester, the nearby country town, and there he received a good grounding in mathematics and Latin. Then he was apprenticed to the local architecture firm of John Hicks. Then he moved to London in 1862, where he was employed as a draftsman in the office of a leading ecclesiastical architect working on Gothic churches and rectory houses and participating in the culture of the great metropolis of London. Thomas Hardy's family could not afford a university education, and it was because of this unaffordability on the part of his family that his mother got him as an apprentice to this John Hicks architectural firm. It was his early ambition to get university education and eventually to become an Anglican priest. But because his family could not afford university education for him, so and his ill health brought him back to Dorchester. Hardy's working class origin caused him some sort of anxiety, uh, but his early immersion into the rhythms of nature, oral culture of his area, and folk traditions had a very profound effect on his uh, career as an artist, both as a novelist and a poet. Uh, and after when he didn't achieve immediate publication of his poetic volume, uh, he reluctantly turned to prose. And he regarded himself a poet rather than a novelist, though it turned out that he was a greater novelist uh, than a poet. When Hardy was in London, he experimented with different political forms, as well as he learned Greek. And when he came to novel writing, uh, he started with his a very uh, class conscious novel, The Poor Man and the Lady. That was too critical to status quo, and it was quite a socialistic novel, but it was rejected on the grounds that because it was too critical to the status quo. And after that, he wrote Desperate Remedies, uh, which was influenced by the contemporary sensation fiction of Vicky Collins. In his next novel, it was his own voice uh, that, and Hardy uh, emerged as a uh, novelist. It was uh, Under the Greenwood Tree. He found a voice much more distinctively his own in this novel, as I earlier said. And in this book, he evoked, within the simplest of marriage plots, an episode of social change that was direct reflection of events involving his own father shortly before Hardy's own birth. And we have a list of some major works of his. They are not mentioned in the chronological order, but we have uh, some of the major works by by Hardy. For example, this Tess of D'Urberville's, and it was the novel that was written in the uh, late later years of Hardy's career as a novelist, and it was questioning about the social attitude towards sex, uh, and the very heroine of this novel, uh, Tess, who's been raped by the son of her employer. Uh, it raises questions that is quite pertinent to the 20th century. Then we have Jude the Obscure. It's also quite contemporary to the Test of the D'Urbervilles. The Return of the Native is also one of the accomplished novel by Hardy. Uh, the Woodlanders, we have the Nests, Far from the Madding Crowd, one of his early novel. Uh, it's very important one. Then we have the Mayor of Casterbridge. Is also the topic of my presentation, then under the greenwood tree, I have already mentioned the hand of Ethelberta, another novel from his early ages as a novelist. Then we have Desperate Remedies. We have talked about it. So these have been one of the major, some of the major works written by Thomas Hardy as a novelist. Though he uh, considered himself to be a poet, primarily a poet, uh, not a novelist throughout his career. As far as the historical and philosophical background is concerned, vis-a-vis Thomas Hardy's career as a novelist, Hardy was of the view that he wasn't following any particular philosophy. Rather, his was a confused heap of impression that he was writing on, and as he was writing in an age uh, of transition, almost towards the close of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, Victorian and modern era. Uh, and he was feeling, as well as he was affected as well uh, by the emerging changes that were taking place in the socio cultural, as well as the science and technological spheres of life, socio-economic sector as well. So his multifaceted interests and the diverse changes in the social life led him to a bifurcated approach to the ideas of his time. Uh, and as he was influenced by the great philosopher and moralists of his age, like Darwin, Huxley, Spencer, Comte, Hume, Mill, and many more great philosophers and moralists of his age. So these contrasting sort of uh, interests and deflective and denying and the informative and analytical approaches basically epitomizes his bifurcated approach to the ideas of his time. And because of his bifurcated approach towards his contemporary ideas and emerging changes, he appears before us like knowing and unknowing, at the same time an intellectual and an instinctive, derivative and original as well. So we can make our analysis of Hardy's career as a novelist uh, in different aspects of his character as an artist, uh, through religious, the scientific, uh, the free thinking, the pessimist, and the meliorist. Uh, this is how we can make an analysis of his character as an artist, as a novelist, through such headings uh, and aspects of his life and character. The publication of numerous historical novels during the Victorian era uh, attest to the survival of Sir Walter Scott's legacy, uh, and despite this legacy, Hardy's uh, Wessex historical novels. I would later explain what this term Wessex actually means. It's a very particular term that is related to Hardy. Uh, his uh, Wessex historical novels form a break from Scott's tradition of historical romances. And the two great novels of Hardy, The Mayor of Casterbridge and Tess of the Willis, illustrate Hardy's substitution of the socio-economic and technological changes that took place in rural England during the 1830s. Uh, for Scott's political context to portray their impact on the rural communities. So at the same time, Hardy's Wessex novels depicts the rise and fall of uh, Napoleon Bonaparte, uh, exhibits the skeptical spirit of the age in terms of the assimilation of the principles of leading philosophers, historians, and biologists of his time, as we have already discussed in the previous slide. Uh, Nietzsche, Auguste Comte, Arthur Schopenhauer, Thomas Carlyle, and Charles Darwin. Uh, these have been a very major influence on Thomas Hardy's writings as a novelist, and as to how he's been handling his subject matter uh, in accordance with the emerging sensibilities and emerging changes in the social scenario. Hardy himself acknowledges the impact of these great people uh, on his outlook on life in general, on history especially. And according to Hardy's work, his representative works, uh, these works of Hardy test test the influence of these intellectuals, uh, and his conception of the historical process. Basically, he regards the historical process as a process of repeated tragedies rather than of progress, uh, because his evaluation of changes that were taking place in that age, and his views on the universal condition of humanity throughout the history has been like a struggle between man and between man and his fate. And obviously we find in Hardy's novel very much like we find fate in the Greek plays to be superior force, being all powerful but blind to human suffering. So it was this kind of attitude on the part of Thomas Hardy that he grew a fatalist in this regard. And that fatalistic philosophy actually is working in most of his novels. Hardy's fictional methods, like his manipulation of time, as to how he specially connects the ancient past with the present, and dramatizes his own personal sort of convictions on history and life. Uh, this is how, and he also, because of his restricted uh, Wessex uh, novels, he's been creating a sort of unity of time and place, because he doesn't go beyond his own homeland. Uh, as far as Hardy's regionalism is concerned, uh, actually Hardy created a setting that was both real and fictional, uh, and he set his stories in the region of Wessex, a fictionalized landscape that was closely resembling to his native country of Dorset. It's basically southwest England, the area of southwest England, where he was born and has been resident of uh, most of the time of his life. And this literary device, this fictionalized and somewhat real landscape, served as a literary device as well, and it had a significant advantages for Hardy. He could infuse his novels and short stories with appealing local color through traditional folkways and dialect of this region, the people of this region. Then he could critique social prejudices and injustices without unduly offending the real life culprits. Uh, and again, he could appeal to familiar characters type and landscapes, while characterizing them in a somewhat uh, unfamiliar and alluring light. So the very title of Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, suggests the town of Casterbridge, that is located in Wessex country, and shares the spotlight. An author feels obliged by offering a broad variety of descriptions to the streets, inns, nearby roads, and landmarks such as the Ring, an ancient Roman amphitheater. So this is how he restricts his stories, his novels, within that region, the region of Wessex. Let's brief Wessex, a term that is uh, particularly related to Hardy's novels, and his novels are popular as Wessex novels, because the world of Hardy's novels consists of the region consisting of a part of southwest England, to which he gave its old name, Wessex, and some other similar rural places like these. As Hardy was belonged to the rural working class, he was keenly interested in depicting the life of the peasantry uh, in his own homeland, uh, and the areas around. And he was advocating their beliefs as well as their values and traditions. When he goes out of his chosen region to deal with the civilized and sophisticated life of cities, he's writing lost its natural enthusiasm, enjoyment, and vigor, uh, and it became quite artificial, and Hardy appeared to be struggling with his art of writing. Hardy was said to be the first English novelist to write about the countryside, uh, on the inspiration offered him by the people of the country uh, in which he was born and spent most of his life. Uh, he was writing about the people of the countryside, and it's in a very serious fashion. And obviously, he drew constantly on the inspiration that were offered by the people of this countryside. As Diana Neal remarks about Hardy's this Wessex novels and the background that served as a background to his novels, as no other novelist can render the sights and smells of the countryside with such evocative sensuousness. So this is how he uses the place or the Wessex region as a background to his novels. Hardy observed various phenomena of nature in their changing aspects in this countryside, and he also observed nature very closely and presented uh, in his novels uh, this nature with deep fidelity to the details related to nature. Uh, in his novels, uh, as it appears often, uh, that it shares uh, feelings of man as a whole. Nature, but it remains quite indifferent to man's suffering. It is against the background of the vast universe that the drama of human life is enacted in Hardy's novels, and the tragedy of his heroes and heroines take place. Hardy presents a picture of the vast elemental forces and shows their working on man's life. That's why we see that how human beings shown in Hardy's novels are largely shaped by the environment around them, and their behavior, their struggle, their achievements are all dependent on some way or the other to their environment as well. Uh, we can quote the example of Edgden Heath in The Return of the Native, uh, and we have the two prominent characters as well, this Eustacia Y and Clem Bright. They how they have been shaped by by their environment, and how much Edgden Heath had a great influence on the characters of both Eustacia Y and Clem Bright. Hardy, unlike George Meredith, his contemporary novelist, uh, in whose novels greater importance is attached to man than to the universe around him. But in Hardy's world, the natural universe is given more importance than man and his society. And he regards nature and the natural universe as some unintelligible force. So this kind of attitude towards nature, uh, Hardy grew a fatalist in his attitude towards life, and for him, life was essentially tragic. That's why tragedy became his forte. Uh, he presents man's struggle and suffering in the face of a hostile universe, and ultimately encountering defeat and death at the hands of fate and circumstances. We may refer to some of the important characters from different novels of Hardy, like Hankered, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and this uh, Justitia from The Return of the Native. Then we have this the Woodlanders. Uh, so people have been shown in a desperate struggle against uh, this uh, overpowering and domineering sort of force of nature, fate. These tragedies of Hardy's uh, actually comprise the element of gloom and despair, which is intensified by the death of the central characters, as I have just mentioned a few names of Hankard, Justitia Vai, and Tess, and very many like these. So the tragedy in Hardy's novels transcends the purely local and individual, and it seems that it will engulf the whole human race in its cosmic sweep. So it is caused by the defeat of human beings at the hands of uh, a very vast and powerful force of nature, maybe fate, universe, or even providence. Hardy, in presenting human life uh, as a tragedy, may be said to be expressing his own pessimism and his personal gloomy view of life. Uh, he appears to be uh, embedded, uh, his pessimism can be analyzed to be lying in the social conditions that existed in his own age, that comprised a rapid advancement in science and technology, and that brought about a loss of old religious faith and long cherished values of life. So Hardy basically himself suffered this loss of religious belief, and he followed and the adoption of a belief in an impersonal fate that we see in several of his novels. His disgust at the modern life and civilization, uh, very much like the way Matthew Arnold felt, another poet of the Victorian era. Uh, so we can make an inference that it was because of the disgust against the modern life and civilization uh, may be responsible for this loss of faith and growth of pessimistic outlook of Hardy. So we have a lot of chances and coincidences and accidents and malignant fate working uh, to inflict unmerited sufferings on human beings to bring to their failure, their defeat, and even to their death. As far as Hardy's art of characterization is concerned, uh, Hardy appears to be more interested in portraying the elemental power of the universe and the world around him than the individual characters. But anyway, he is a master of characterization, portraying his characters through their distinguishing features like their speech and manners, their behaviors, uh, and his major characters are also portrayed with a psychological insight, whereas the minor characters they just bring us a comic relief or a chorus like commentary on the existing situation. Uh, as we see his characters like Sue and Eustacia White, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Gabriel Oak are delineated in a very subtle manner, but the minor characters they are usually the rustics, common rustics. They hardly come under the purview of his analytical scrutiny. Uh, Most of the time he employs his characters as just the mouthpiece of uh, his philosophy of life. They appear to be expressing uh, his philosophy of life. Uh, and another characteristic of his characterization is that he doesn't go for any gender differences. Rather, he takes men and women as a whole, uh, as a as a being uh, that has been shown in his novel, struggling against the uh, overwhelming force of fate or universe. So Hardy uh, chooses his human types from those who are closest to nature, uh, those in whom the primitive impulses are the strongest. Uh, and instead of remaining preoccupied with the psychological complexities of his characters, Hardy basically shows the struggle between these characters and the indifferent universe. They have been thrown into by the accident of their birth. So this is how he creates and portrays his characters in different of his novels. The plots of Hardy's novel appear to be quite in line with the tradition of realism as far as Victorian novel is concerned. George Eliot, we have an example for that purpose, and he uses great details and descriptions for character delineation or the painting of scenes and situation, uh, or even for the construction of plot. So just to give a very comprehensive and realistic picture of uh, the life he is presenting in his novel. Sorry, plots have been constructed by Hardy with a great skill and reveal his inventive powers. Often, the plots are a bit, their validity is marred because of the ample element of improbability, implausibility, causality, and coincidences, because he uses very many times chances and coincidences and accidents and things, the role of fate, that 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 the very logical connections between the incidents appear to be a bit improbable. But plots of Hardy's novels comprise a sort of unity to the structure, because they are so carefully arranged, these events and situation, and they are helpful in imparting a unity to the structure of the whole novel. Plots comprise both the internal and external conflicts, and sometimes combination of both the internal and the external, as we have in The Mayor of Casterbridge, as well as in Test of the D'Urbervilles, and some of other Hardy's novels. Sudden shifts in the plot from one scene to another put a strain on the common reader's attention. However, through the careful and keenly constructed plots, events through events and situations, uh, Hardy tries to impart a unity to the overall structure of his novels, despite the complex nature of these structures. Plots basically serve as a compact unit to convey his tragic view of life. Uh, in all the scenes and events lead towards a climax, which embodies this gloomy view of life that Hardy tries to employ in even in the construction of his plots of the novel. Uh, to the close of my presentation, I have a few details to share with you people as the introduction to the novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, but I would like to, and I would try my best to cover the maximum. Like most of Hardy's novels, the Mayor of Casterbridge is a tragedy. It doesn't matter at all whatever the main characters wanted to accomplish. The fate appears to get in the way. And Hardy doesn't just finds the simple way out, that it was only fate. No, not at all, because Hardy also bring into light the mistakes and the wrong decisions that were made by the protagonist of the novel. So the very subtitle of the novel, uh, The Life and Death of a Man of Character, uh, it shows that it, and reminds us that the protagonist will die at the end. And because it is Thomas Hardy's novel, we can be sure that it won't be a happy death. The novel actually exposes all kinds of emotions, passions of hate, love, and jealousies that rustic life could inspire. Uh, and Hardy has been greatly interested in the lives of the of his rustic characters. He portrays the scenes and situations along with the characters through all the strengths and weaknesses of his characters. Hardy's realistic portrayal of the Wessex environment uh, needs no description, because uh, the fictional towns, farms, rivers, and forests in Wessex are common to all his novels. So this novel also follows the same trend of taking Wessex as a background to the story. Hardy's philosophy dramatizes the human condition of a struggle between man and between man and his fate. And we see Hankard and other characters also in the novel. They are struggling against one another, as well as struggling against the force of fate. Powerful fate has been set against man's struggle, man's efforts to accomplish his tasks. Hankard's offense, as he sells his wife and a daughter uh, just to a passing sailor, uh, was a crime or an offense against morality. So he faces the consequences of his crime and offenses, uh, though he feels remorse and uh, even was to set it right. But he actually never has been successful to accomplish the task. The novel ends on a note of hope, because Hardy Hankard's strength of his will and his determination to bear the sufferings and deprivation uh, that were the consequences of his offenses, his crimes, his mistakes, flaws of his characters. But though he hadn't any control over that, uh, and as well as his wrong decisions, so his will and determination to suffer and this loss and deprivation, in order to expiate his sins, basically makes uh, the ending of the novel a bit optimistic, uh, though this element makes the Mayor of Casterbridge, this novel, a very unique sort of outgrowth of Hardy's philosophy. Uh, in the presence of the scientific and technological changes that were emerging in the age of Hardy, like Darwin's The Origin of Species, science reversing prevailing opinions, and superstitions, life becoming in general faster, harsher, and less concerned with beauty and art, and more occupied with the practical economics. Uh, the validity of Hardy's pessimism remains intact, because as a product of his age, was profoundly affected by these violent changes and forces, which seem to toss man uh, about like a rag doll. Uh, so he in this novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, he posed the solution to the dilemma. Man can overcome, uh, because he has the ability and strength to endure. So despite his pessimistic bent of mind, he poses a sort of though a very bleak, but there is a bleak ray of optimism, but that is very much there. To conclude the whole discussion so far, uh, we can reach a conclusion about Thomas Hardy as a novelist, that there are no doubt certain shortcomings as far as the handling of plots and the portrayal of the characters, uh, his pessimism and tragic mindset. They are no doubt, they are sometimes very overpowering and overwhelming sort of things in the novels. But along with those shortcomings, uh, Hardy has something of greatness about himself as a novelist. Like we can say that his greatness as a novelist comprise his cosmic view of life in general, and the beauty and dignity of his best work. Uh, then his view of a malignant fate and a hostile nature may be a bit too gloomy to be easily acceptable, but his concern for the depiction of the pitiable lot of man in this world is admirable indeed. And then we see that the way he handles his plots and situation and settings of his novels is really reveals the hand of a superb craftsman. So Hardy was a great poet, uh, as well as a great novelist of English literature, but his true greatness as a novelist shadows his glory as a poet. That's all from my side as far as the Hardy's career as a novelist is concerned. In the later uh, presentation, I would try to cover uh, the plot overview of the novel The Mayor of Casterbridge, and look into the major and minor characters and their development through the course of the novel. Thank you very much for the patience. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.